Here we are with day 10. We are 1/3 of the way through all of this crazy Photoshop knowledge, and we haven't even scratched the surface yet. That's how deep and how vast Photoshop is. I love Photoshop for that reason. I've been in Photoshop since 1998. We're talking almost 22 years now, and I still can't get enough of it. So yesterday we talked about opacity and fill. The day before we talked about adjustment layers. Today we're going to talk about blend modes. And blend modes are kind of like the foundation to advanced editing in Photoshop. They're really powerful, but they're really confusing to understand unless you've had some experience playing and toying with them. Experimentation is the key here, and I'm going to tell you why. A lot of people that come into Photoshop, I'd say if we had to put a statistic on it, 95% of people probably only use 3 or 4 different blend modes, and there's 27 of them. Now, blend modes can be very helpful for you if you know them, and that's why I'm going to teach you these blend modes, okay? We're not going to go over every single one of them with a fine-tooth comb, or we'd be here for 2 hours. I've already created an entire course on all 27 blend modes that I think was like 2.5 to 3 hours long or something like that. It was crazy. It was a lot of information about all the different blend modes packed into one course. So I can't do all that right now, but what I can do is give you an introduction to them, to understand what they do, why they're there, and why we use them. A blend mode is nothing more than a fancy term for turning pixels on and turning pixels off, and how you turn those pixels on and how you turn those pixels off. So the demonstration image that we have here, it basically just shows a gradient at the bottom from black to white, transitioning with a very nice strong mid-tone in between. And then on the top, we see black blocks and white blocks and a gray block, a perfect 50% gray block in between. Now that's important because the way these pixels get turned on and off is they usually get turned on and off. Most of them are turned on and off based off of their luminance value, or what pixels are going to be turned off and what pixels are going to be turned on based on how bright that pixel is. That's what a blend mode is. It's really fancy and you can really get into the weeds on it. I actually created a PDF for you here. If you open up this PDF, it's the same PDF that's actually included in my blend modes course. But what we're going to see here is these blend modes, they find themselves in this area in the layers palette. And each area in the blend mode section here, you're going to see it's kind of divided up in Photoshop, is a different type of blend mode section. So we have darken blend modes, we have lighten blend modes, we have contrast blend modes, and we have equation blend modes, and color attribute blend modes. Now these equation blend modes are really advanced. You probably won't be using them very much. You'll probably stick with a lot of these contrast blend modes and maybe only 2 of these that are in the darken and lighten blend modes here. And these contrast and these color attribute blend modes are actually really helpful when you're trying to divide out the color or the luminance from a certain layer. So this is here for you to download as a reference to go along with this lesson. So please feel free to do that. I would highly recommend it and print it out and keep it next to you as a set of notes that you can have with you. You can go to this helpx.adobe.com for more information on these blend modes, but this is my way of saying, here's the simplified, straight to the facts, how to use these blend modes. Okay, so let's start this out by showing you first where the blend modes are. The blend modes find themselves right here in this section, right next to opacity. You have blend modes. So if you look at this now, the buildup of things that we have in an individual layer. We've got the layer itself, we've got the opacity, we've got the fill, and now we've got the blend mode. Now the blend mode, if we go here and go to dissolve, dissolve really isn't going to do anything for you. Normal is going to get it back to where it was from the very beginning. Every layer is going to start out as normal unless prescribed otherwise in an action or something. The darken blend modes are going to be right here in this section here. You have your darken blend mode, your multiply blend mode, color blur, color burn, linear burn, and darker color. So if you look at this here, the darken blend mode, just as we see on the PDF, if the selected layer is darker than the underlying layer, the data is replaced with the dark information. So what that's saying is that if this layer up here has anything darker than what's underneath it, then all we're going to see are the darker things. Okay, and that's basically how all these darken blend modes work. The actual darken blend mode itself isn't actually that effective. What's more effective is this multiply blend mode. And you can see that because of how, when we select the multiply blend mode, how it has a nice smooth transition here. So of all of these blend modes here, the one that you're probably going to find the most effective is going to be the multiply blend mode. The color burn and linear burn blend modes are also very helpful, but they aren't very helpful unless you use fill with them. There are 8 blend modes that are characterized as the fill blend modes. And if you just use the opacity on here, you're not going to see much of a difference in the calculation. But if you use the fill here and you move the fill down, you see a difference in the calculation and how it works. Now we'll talk about those fill blend modes as we get towards the end of this lesson. Let's move on down here to the Lighten blend modes. The Lighten blend mode is if the selected layer is lighter than the underlying layer, the data is replaced with the lighter information. So if you actually were to take this Lighten blend mode section and the Darken blend mode section and put them next to each other, guess what? They're polar opposites of each other. So whatever's in the Lighten blend mode is the opposite of the Darken blend mode. Whatever's opposite of screen is going to be multiply. So screen and multiply are basically based off of the same thing, but one is for darkening and one is for lightening. Color dodge and linear dodge are brothers and sisters to color burn and linear burn, and then we have lighter color. But what you're going to see here is the one that you're going to use primarily in these two sections are going to be multiply to get the darkened areas to stay and screen to get the whiter areas to stay. This can be a really effective way of dropping out black areas in a photograph, and then the only thing that's left over is the white stuff that's going to apply itself to the image. Now this, like as we said before, when we talk about non-destructive editing, we didn't actually delete the black pixels in this layer. Okay, what we did was we just told those black pixels to turn themselves off and then only allow the white pixels to remain on. So what you can see here is that anything that's in the black area is completely turned off. White pixels are completely turned on. Medium gray pixels have a half or 50% effect of what would be in the darkest dark pixels, okay? Or a 50% effect of what would happen with the opaque white pixels. So these things can be really confusing, I know that. And as we work through the rest of these 30 days, when I'm using blend modes, I'll tell you why I'm using them and what that blend mode does, which will really help you understand these blend modes a little bit more. Moving on down the line, we have the contrast blend modes. And these blend modes can be really effective for making really fast and quick adjustments because they boost and increase the contrast in your image as you work with them. Now, I know that right now we're working with this really boring image that we have here of just black and white pixels with a transition, but we'll talk about some practical application here in a second. So the overlay blend mode is actually a combination of screen and multiply. So basically they took screen, they took multiply, they smashed them together. But what they did was they said, okay, you can be the screen blend mode and the multiply blend mode at the exact same time, but don't let areas that are dark become black and don't let areas that are white become pure white. So now what you see here with the overlay blend mode is that up here in the darkest dark areas, those pixels don't exactly turn black. They're governed a little bit at maybe like a 75% effect. So instead of this being pure black that's now rested on top of the image, it's saying, okay, you can be about 75% of that. Let's go ahead and turn this to normal and actually change the opacity to 75%. Now, it's about a 75% effect, but there's a contrast blend that's happening at the same time that makes things darker. See that? We can't actually mimic the effect here because what's happening here is that the overlay blend mode has some math that's taking place in there too to increase the contrast of not just the tones, but also the colors. So you can see here that the effect is not quite that 100% that we would see from multiply or screen. That's why we don't see pure black or pure white up here. The next one down is going to be soft light, which soft light is actually like the distant brother to overlay. It's kind of like overlay, but a very limited effect. So typically I use soft light when I'm using these blend modes for these amplified contrasts. I'll use soft light as opposed to overlay because soft light works a little bit slower. It's not quite as intense and it has like this nice kind of just draping effect over the image. And you can create some very phenomenal things with this. Hard light, on the other hand, is actually a combination of linear dodge and linear burn. So it results in a more contrast-rich version of overlay and is very heavily weighted on the selected layer rather than the pixels that are underneath. Okay, so hard light, this typically is something that you're going to use with the opacity and fill adjustments. Most of these blend modes, as you use them with any other adjustment layers, you're more than likely going to be using these with opacity and fill in mind. Okay, so moving on down, vivid light. Vivid light's a combination of color burn and linear dodge. It increases and decreases the contrast based on the selected layer. Many of these blend modes like hard light, vivid light, linear light, pin light, and hard mix are really going to have a very distinct purpose and a distinct use for them, and you probably won't find much use for them now. At the beginning of this, I said that most people only use 3 to 4 blend modes. Well, typically the 3 to 4 that they're going to use are going to be soft light, multiply, overlay, and screen. And that's most of the people that you see using blend modes, that's what they're using because they're the easiest to understand. However, I'm going to show you as we progress through these 30 days how some of these other blend modes can be really powerful in your workflow. As we move on down, the difference blend mode basically makes a calculation based off of the inverted pixels in the image. You're not going to be using difference much. You're more than likely not going to use exclusion much, or subtract or divide. These are very difficult blend modes to use, and typically you only use them, as I said, for very specific reasons, and if you really know how to use them with your experimentation. It's hard to reproduce the things that are going to happen with these blend modes, and therefore you're probably not going to use them much. Before we go down to the color attribute blend modes, let's talk about the 8 blend modes that are fill blend modes. Those fill blend modes are going to be color burn, linear burn, color dodge, linear dodge, vivid light, linear light, hard mix, and difference. So if we were to choose something like the hard mix blend mode, it's a hideous blend mode. Look at it. Basically what it's doing is it's saying that you can only really have 8 colors at any given time when hard mix is at its 100% potential. Now, if we drop the opacity on this, it's still doing the same thing. So what we need to do here is use the fill slider. So the fill slider with these 8 blend modes that we just talked about actually becomes like a calculation adjustment. It says, okay, I'm going to do something to these pixels that you told me to do something to, but you can change that calculation. So right now it's showing us 8 colors, basically black, white, magenta, red, blue, cyan, and green. Those are the only colors it's going to show us. But as we move this down, even if we move this down to 99%, it's going to open up more colors. If we move this down to 90%, we'll just type 90 in here, it's going to open us up to more colors. So as we move this slider down, you start to see that it does some increasing and does some really interesting things with the math in the image. And actually, hard mix is one of my absolute favorite blend modes, and I'll show you why later as we progress through these next 30 days. But hard mix is a blend mode that I use a lot for some very special, what I call color grading. So we probably won't touch on this very much until the very end of the discussion here in the 30 days. Mainly when we get into the workflow section of things where I'm showing you tone, color, and artistic effects, I'll be using hard mix during that point. So I'm going to turn this layer off now, and we're going to do these color attribute blend modes. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a hue saturation adjustment layer so we can kind of see how these work, okay? And I'm going to move this down just a little bit here. So I'm going to move the saturation up here, really high up, make it ugly, make it horrible. But now I'm going to go down here to the saturation. So what the saturation blend mode does is it applies the selected layer's hue and saturation, but it preserves the underlying layer's luminance values. So as we use this, if we set this to saturation, it's going to make sure that all of the underlying layer's luminance values stay, or the black point and white point stay. If we were to, let's do something like this. Let's do something where we increase the saturation, we decrease the luminance, and do a big hue shift. This will let us see this even more. So now if we change this to the saturation blend mode, it's only going to let us see the saturation and the hue that has been applied through that HSL adjustment. If we change this to the hue blend mode, it's only going to let the hue of the colors shift on there. So this is a way that we can kind of split the HSL adjustment. If we were to go down to luminance, on the other hand, this is only going to change the luminance values of everything underneath while preserving the colors. So the luminance will change underneath, but all the colors will pretty much stay the same. If we change this to the color blend mode, then as we move this, the luminance values that are underneath are going to stay the same, and the color blend mode is going to apply the hue and the saturation changes to the image while the luminance values remain the same. So the underlying layer's luminance is preserved, and the only thing that's happening here is color. So I'm going to give you a practical application of this because it can be very difficult to understand that without it. So one of my favorite adjustment layers here that I've been dying to show you is the solid color adjustment layer. Let's change this solid color adjustment layer to a bluish color like this, a really nice blue. We'll press OK. So we have this set to this blue. If we change this to the hue, it's going to change the entire image over to the hue of that color. What that means is that the luminance and saturation of all the underlying layers are staying the same. So we're basically making this a blue to white image based off of the data that's underneath that's shining through it. If we change this to saturation, it's going to basically tell all of the colors that are in this image to get as saturated as the colors in this color fill. So if we double click this color fill and I move this over here, this is a very desaturated color. So now all the colors underneath are getting desaturated. This is a very saturated color. So we're basically telling all of the underlying layers to borrow the saturation of this color. So as we move this saturation here, that's what changes the output from what we're inputting into this layer. So this is the input into this layer, and this is the output that it's showing us, okay? So let's change this blend mode to the color blend mode. So when we have this at the color blend mode at 100% opacity, we're basically getting what would be what we call a monochromatic image, where the whole photo then takes on the color of this color that we have selected. But the luminance values stay the same. So this can be really effective for what we call color grading. So if I drop the opacity here down to something like maybe 15%, then what happens is we just kind of wash this image with color, which is very similar to what you saw in the photo filter adjustment layer, isn't it? But here we get more control. We get more control because we have the opacity, we have the color that we can choose, which lets us make a lot more decisions as to what's happening with this color than just the photo filter where we don't know what it's exactly doing, okay? If we change this down here to luminosity, that's going to be horrible for this. The reason why is because it's applying the selected layer's luminance while preserving the hue and saturation of everything underneath. So what that means is that we have basically kind of like a color map here. So if we change this to, let's say, a 50% gray, we'll just go to a straight 50% gray here, we actually are seeing the hue and saturation that varies or gets stronger or lighter than the 50% gray that we have selected here. Really kind of some nerdy stuff. But this is where blend modes become really powerful. If we were to choose a curves adjustment layer, and we were to maybe do a contrast curve like this, okay, like you saw before, but then change this to something like soft light, you'll notice the intensity that happens here. It's much more intense than just leaving this at normal. And the reason why is because the way soft light works. It's going to leave anything that's 50% gray alone. So even if we were to do something like this, it's going to leave 50% gray alone, or anything that's right in the middle of this, and it's going to make the darks get darker and the brights get brighter without getting pure white or pure black. So we get a lot of really nice contrast there with a soft light blend mode on this. We'll change this to soft light blend mode on this with an S curve here. Really nice results. And then if it's too much, we just drop this opacity, and that's the effect. So as I stated, hard mix is one of my favorites, and I'm going to show you why. Let's take that solid color again. Let's make that that bluish color, and let's change this to the hard mix blend mode. So now it's only going to give us those 8 colors like it did before, but it's going to be 8 colors that are a variation of this color blue because of the way it's applying itself to the image. This, I said before, is not an opacity blend mode. It is a fill blend mode. So as we drop the fill, watch those calculations change and watch how we can get some really beautiful contrast in this image while also applying a color. If we double click this color, we can change this color to any other color we want. We move the color picker around, and then we start to move the hue slider up and down. Look at how we just made this image look as if it's almost at sunset. Look at that. This is like, right here, this is like the blue hour is starting to kick in. All right, if we get down to here, it gets nice and dark down there. But look at how we get this nice transition of color added to this image while also getting that beautiful contrast. This is very difficult to do without using blend modes. You can't really do this very well in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, and these are the reasons why we use Photoshop to manipulate our photos. It's not because we're trying to do evil things to our photographs, it's because we're trying to get our feeling and our mood across in the image as we process that photo. So the hard mix blend mode set to something like 15% on a color fill adjustment layer. Absolutely phenomenal effects. Okay, so that's what we need to know about blend modes. Blend modes are just a way to turn pixels on and turn pixels off. And the blend mode dictates how those pixels are going to be turned on, how they're going to be turned off, and how they're going to calculate with the input that's underneath them. It can be kind of confusing to understand, okay? I'm trying to give you as much knowledge as I can here so that you can run with it, but at the same time, not try to give you too much so that you don't want to run at all, okay? Blend modes can be tricky to wrap your head around at the very beginning of things, but you notice how we build things up here. We started off talking about layers. Then we went from layers to adjustment layers. Then from adjustment layers to opacity and fill. Then from adjustment layers and opacity and fill to now adjustment layers, opacity, fill, and blend modes. It's all a build-up process. And that's why it's really important that as you progress through these 30 days, that after we get done with each lesson, you also take the time to experiment. So what I'd like you to do is take this file that I've given you here, this lesson 10 blend modes file, and I'd like you to experiment with different blend modes. Use the color fill, use different adjustment layers, use adjustment layers and use blend modes, and just play with opacity and fill. I can tell you this, I have taught myself a lot of different things. Some people think I'm some type of wild genius when it comes to Photoshop. That's not the case. What I know is pattern recognition. I know that when I do this, I get this result. And if I do this several times, I continue to get this result. So if I continue to do this in the future, I'm going to receive these results. If you jump into Photoshop and you don't do this experimentation process, you will not grasp everything that you need to grasp, and you'll think that other people are geniuses when in reality, all they're doing is failing through Photoshop. Everything I do is failing through Photoshop. 22 years of failing through Photoshop. And what I record and give to you are the highlight reels, the things that worked. In tomorrow's lesson, we're going to tackle blend if, which is another application that we have in any given layer. So we're building this thing up. We're keeping this train moving. I think that you're really going to like tomorrow's lesson because blend if is my favorite topic in Photoshop.